Good morning, 5A. Hope you're well. Right, I'm going to get on with reading the next chapter of Howl's Moving Castle, chapter 7. Link in the box below, as usual. Alright, let's make a start. Chapter 7, in which a scarecrow prevents Sophie from leaving the castle. Only a particularly bad attack of aches and pains prevented Sophie from setting out for market chipping that evening. But the drizzle in Porthaven had got into her bones. She lay in her cubbyhole and ached and worried about Martha. It might not be so bad, she thought. She only had to tell Martha that the suitor she wasn't sure about was none other than Wizard Howl. That would scare Martha off. And she would tell Martha that the way to scare Howl off was to announce that she was in love with him, and then perhaps to threaten him with aunts. Sophie was still creaking when she got up the next morning. Curse the Witch of the Waste, she muttered to her stick as she got it out, ready to leave. She could hear Howl singing in the bathroom, as if he'd never had a tantrum in his life. She tiptoed to the door as fast as she could hobble. Howl, of course, came out of the bathroom before she reached it. Sophie looked at him sourly. He was all spruce and dashing, scented gently with apple blossom. The sunlight from the window dazzled off his grey and scarlet suit and made a faintly pink halo of his hair. "I think my hair looks rather good this colour," he said. "Do you indeed?" grumped Sophie. "It goes with this suit," said Howl. "You've quite a touch with your needle, don't you? You've given the suit more style somehow." Said Sophie. Howl stopped with his hand on the knob above the door. "Aches and pains troubling you? Or has something annoyed you?" "Annoyed?" said Sophie. "Why should I be annoyed? Someone only filled the castle with rotten aspic, deafened everyone in Porthaven, scared Calcifer to a cinder and broke a few hundred hearts. Why should that annoy me?" Howl laughed. "I apologise," he said, turning the knob to red down. "The king wants to see me today. I shall probably be kicking my heels in the palace until evening, but I can do something for your rheumatism when I get back. Don't forget to tell Michael I left the spell for him on the bench." He smiled sunnily at Sophie and stepped out among the spires of Kingsbury. "And you think that makes it all right?" growled Sophie as the door shut. But the smile had mollified her. "And if that smile works on me, it's no wonder poor Martha doesn't know her own mind," she muttered. "I shall need another log before you go," Calcifer reminded her. Sophie hobbled to drop another log into the grate. Then she set off to the door again. But here Michael came running downstairs and snatched the remains of a loaf off the bench as he ran to the door. "You don't mind, do you?" he said in an agitated way. "I'll bring a fresh loaf when I come back. I've got something very urgent to see to today, but I'll be back by evening. If the sea captain calls for his wind spell, it's on the end of the bench, clearly marked." He turned the knob green downward and jumped onto the windy hillside, loaf clutched to his stomach. "See you," he shouted as the castle trundled away past him and the door slammed. "Botheration," said Sophie. "Calcifer, how does a person open the door when there's no one inside the castle?" "I'll open it for you, or Michael. Howl does it himself," said Calcifer. So no one would be locked out when Sophie left. She wasn't at all sure she'd be coming back, but she didn't intend to tell Calcifer. She gave Michael time to get well on the way to wherever he was going, and set off for the door again. This time Calcifer stopped her. "If you're going to be away long," he said, you might like to leave some logs where I can reach them." "Can you pick up logs?" Sophie asked, intrigued in spite of her impatience. For answer, Calcifer stretched out a blue arm-shaped flame divided into green finger-like flames at the end. It wasn't very long, nor did it look strong. "See? I can almost reach the hearth," he said proudly. Sophie stacked a pile of logs in front of the grate so Calcifer could at least reach the top one. "You're not to burn them before you've got them in the grate," she warned him, and she set off for the door again. This time somebody knocked before she got to it. It's one of those days. Sophie thought, it must be the sea captain. She put her hand to turn the knob blue down. No, it's the castle door," Calcifer said. "But I'm not sure." And it was Michael back for some reason, Sophie thought as she opened the door. A turnip face leered at her. She smelled mildew. Against the wide blue sky, a ragged arm ending in a stump of a stick wheeled round and tried to paw at her. It was a scarecrow. It was only made of sticks and rags, but it was alive and trying to come in. "Calcifer!" Sophie screamed. "Make the castle go faster!" The stone blocks round the doorway crunched and grated. The green-brown moorland was suddenly rushing past. The scarecrow's stick arm thumped on the door and then went scraping along the wall of the castle as the castle left it behind. It wheeled its other arm round and seemed to try and clutch at the stonework. It meant to get into the castle if it could. Sophie slammed the door shut. This, she thought, showed just how stupid it was for an eldest child to try and seek her fortune. That was the scarecrow she'd propped in the hedge on her way to the castle. She made jokes to it. And now, as if her jokes had brought it to evil life, it had followed her all the way here and tried to paw at her face. She ran to the castle to see if the thing was still trying to get into the castle. Ran to the window to see if it was still trying to get into the castle. Of course, all she could see was a sunny day in Port Haven with a dozen sails going up a dozen masts beyond the roofs opposite, and a cloud of seagulls circling in a blue sky. "That's the difficulty of being in several places at once," Sophie said to the human skull on the bench. Then all at once she discovered the real drawback to being an old woman. Her heart gave a leap and a little stutter, and seemed to be trying to bang its way out of her chest. It hurt. She shook all over and her knees trembled. She rather thought she might be dying. It was all she could do to get to the chair by the hearth. She sat there panting, clutching her chest. "Is something the matter?" Calcifer asked. "Yes, my heart. There was a scarecrow at the door," Sophie gasped. "What's a scarecrow got to do with your heart?" Calcifer asked. "It was trying to get in here. It gave me a terrible fright. And my heart... Oh, you wouldn't understand, you silly young demon," Sophie panted. "You haven't got a heart." "Yes, I have," Calcifer said, proudly as proudly as he'd revealed his arm. "Down in the glowing part under the log. And don't call me young. I'm a good million years older than you." "Can I reduce the speed of the castle now?" "Only if the scarecrow's gone," said Sophie. "Has it?" "I can't tell," said Calcifer. "It's not flesh and blood, you see. I told you I couldn't really see outside." Sophie got up and dragged herself to the door again, feeling ill. She opened it slowly and cautiously. Green steepness, rocks and purple slopes whirled past, making her feel dizzy. But she took a grip on the door frame and leaned out. "Hello." "Hi, how are you doing?" "You come and say hello to my class?" This is Eleanor. Hey, sweetie. Right, I'm just going to read this story. Is that okay? All right. Green steepness, rocks and purple slopes whirled past, making her feel dizzy. But she took a grip on the door frame and leaned out to look along the wall to the moorland they were leaving behind. The scarecrow was about 50 yards to the rear. It was hopping from clump to clump with a sort of sinister sort of valiance, holding its fluttering stick arms at an angle to balance it on the hillside. As Sophie watched the castle left it further behind, it was slow, but it was still following. She shut the door. "It's still there," she said, "hopping after us. Go faster." "But that upsets all my calculations," Calcifer explained. "I was aiming to circle the hills and get back to where Michael left us in time to pick him up this evening." "Then go twice as fast. Circle the hills twice. As long as you leave that horrible thing behind," said Sophie. "What a fuss," said Calcifer. But he increased the castle's speed. Sophie could actually, for the first time, feel it rumbling around her as she sat huddled in her chair, wondering if she was dying. She didn't want to die yet before she talked to Martha. As the day went on, everything in the castle began to jiggle with its speed. Bottles chinked. The skull clattered on the bench. Sophie could hear things falling off the shelf in the bathroom and splashing in the bath, where Howl's blue and silver suit was still soaking. She began to feel a little better. She dragged herself to the door again and looked out with her hair flying in the wind. The ground was streaking past underneath. A hill seemed to be spinning slowly as the castle sped across them. The grinding and rumbling nearly deafened her, and smoke was puffing out in blasts. But the scarecrow was a tiny black dot on a distant slope by then. Next time she looked, it was out of sight entirely. "Good, then I shall stop for the night," said Calcifer. "That was quite a strain." The rumbling died away. Things stopped jiggling. Calcifer went to sleep the way fires do, sinking among the logs until there were rosy cylinders plated with white ash, with only a hint of blue and green deep underneath. Sophie felt quite spry again. She went and fished 6 packets and a bottle out of the slimy water in the bath. The packets were soaked. She didn't dare leave them that way after yesterday. She laid them on the floor and very cautiously sprinkled them with the stuff labelled drying power. They were dried almost instantly. This was encouraging. Sophie let the water out of the bath and tried the power on Howl's suit. That dried too. It was still stained green and rather smaller than it had been, but it cheered Sophie up to find she could at least put something right. She felt cheerful enough to busy herself getting supper. She bundled everything onto the bench into a heap round the skull at one end and began chopping onions. "At least your eyes don't water, my friend," she told the skull. "Count your blessings." The door sprang open. Sophie nearly cut herself in fright, thinking it was the scarecrow again, but it was Michael. He burst jubilantly in. He dumped a loaf, a pie, a pink and white striped box on top of the onions. Then he seized Sophie around his skinny waist and danced her around the room. "It's all right, it's all right," he shouted joyfully. Sophie hopped and stumbled to keep out of the way of Michael's boots. "What's all right?" "Letty loves me," Michael shouted, dancing her almost into the bathroom and then almost into the hearth. "She's never even seen Howl. It was all a mistake." He spun them both round in the middle of the room. "Will you let me go before this knife cuts one of us?" Sophie squawked, "and perhaps explain a little?" "Whee-oo!" Michael shouted. He whirled Sophie to the chair and dumped her in it, where she sat gasping. "Last night I wished you dyed his hair blue," he said. "I don't mind now. When Howl said, 'Letty Hatter,' I thought of dyeing him blue myself. You can see the way he talks. I knew he was going to drop this girl, just like all the others, as soon as he'd got her to love him. And that's when I thought it was my Letty. Anyway, he said there was another fellow, and I thought that was me. So I tore down to Market Chipping today, and it was all right. Hal must be after some other girl with the same name. Letty's never seen him. Anyway, he said..." "No. Let's get this straight," Sophie said dizzily. "We are talking about the Letty Hatter who works in Cesari's pastry shop, are we?" "Of course we are," Michael said jubilantly. "I've loved her ever since she started work there. I almost couldn't believe it when she said she loved me. She has hundreds of admirers. I wouldn't be surprised if Howl was one of them. I'm so relieved. I got you a cake from Cesari's to celebrate. Where did I put it? Oh, here it is." He thrust a pink and white box at Sophie. Onion fell off it into her lap. "How old are you, my friend, my child?" Sophie asked. 15 last May Day," said Michael. "Calcifer sent fireworks up from the castle, didn't you, Calcifer?" "Oh, he's asleep." "You're probably thinking, I'm too young to be engaged, and I've still got 3 years of my apprenticeship to run, and Letty's got even longer, but we promised one another, and we don't mind waiting." Then Michael was about the right age for Martha, Sophie thought, and she knew by now he was a nice steady lad with a career as a wizard ahead of him. Bless Martha's heart. When she thought back to that bewildering May Day, she realised Michael had been one of the shouting group leaning on the counter in front of Martha, but Howl had been outside in the market square. "Are you sure your Letty was telling the truth about Howl?" she asked anxiously. "Positive," said Michael. "I know when she's lying. She stops twiddling her thumbs." "She does too," said Sophie, chuckling. "How do you know?" Michael asked in surprise. "Because she's my sister's granddaughter," said Sophie. "And as a small girl, she was not always terribly truthful. But she's quite young and, I suppose she changes as she grows. She may not look quite the same in a year or so." "Neither will I," said Michael. "People our age change all the time. It won't worry us. She'll still be Letty." In a manner of speaking, Sophie thought. But suppose she was telling the truth, she went anxiously, and she just knew Howl under a false name? Michael asked. Michael asked in surprise. Sorry, I've lost my place. Don't worry, I thought of that, said Michael. I described Howl. You must admit he's pretty recognisable, and she really hadn't seen him or his wretched guitar. I didn't even have to tell her. He doesn't know how to play the thing. She never set eyes on him, and she twiddled her thumbs all the time she said that she hadn't. Well, that's a relief, Sophie said, lying stiffly back in her chair. And it certainly was a relief about Martha. But it wasn't much of a relief, because Sophie was positive the only other Letty hatter in the district was the real one. If there'd been another, someone would have come into the hat shop and gossiped about it. And it sounded like strong-minded Letty not giving in to Howl. What worried Sophie was Letty had told Howl her real name. She might not be sure about him, but she liked him enough to trust him with an important secret like that. Don't look so anxious, Michael laughed, leaning back on the chair. Have a look at the cake I brought you. As Sophie started opening the box, it dawned on her Michael had gone from seeing her as a natural disaster to actually liking her. She was so pleased and grateful, she decided to tell Michael the whole truth about Letty and Marta and herself too. It was only fair to let him know the kind of family he was meant to marry into. The box came open. It was Cesare's most luscious cake, covered in cream and cherries and little curls of chocolate. Oh, said Sophie. The square knob over the door clicked round to red blob down of its own accord, and Howl came in. What a marvellous cake. My favourite kind, he said. Where did you get it? I called in at Cesare's, Michael said in a sheepish, self-conscious way. Sophie looked up at Howl. Something was always going to interrupt her when she decided to say she was under a spell, even a wizard it seemed. Looks like it was worth the walk, Howl said, inspecting the cake. I've heard Cesare's is better than any of the cake shops in Kingsbury. Stupid of me never to have been in the place. And is that a pie I see on the bench? He went over to look. Pie in a bed of raw onions. Human skull looking put upon. He picked up the skull and knocked an onion ring out of its eye socket. I see Sophie's been busy again. Couldn't you have restrained her, my friend? The skull yattered its teeth at him. Howl looked startled and put it down hastily. Is something the matter? Michael asked. He seemed to know the signs. There is, said Howl. I shall have to find someone to blacken my name to the king. Oh, was there something wrong with the wagon spell? Said Michael. No, it worked perfectly, that's the trouble, Howl said, restlessly twiddling an onion ring on one finger. The king's trying to pin me down to do something else now. Calcifer, if we're not very careful, he's going to appoint me royal magician. Calcifer didn't answer. Howl roved back to the fireplace and realised Calcifer was asleep. Wake him up, Michael, he said. I need to consult him. Michael threw 2 logs on Calcifer and called him. Nothing happened apart from a thin spire of smoke. Calcifer, Howl shouted. That did no good either. Howl gave a mystified look and picked up the poker, which was something Sophie had never seen him do before. Sorry, Calcifer, he said, jabbing under the unburned logs. Wake up! One thick black cloud of smoke rolled up and stopped. Go away, Calcifer grunted. I'm tired. At this, Calcifer looked thoroughly alarmed. What's wrong with him? I've never known him like this before. I think it was the scarecrow, Sophie said. Hal swiveled around on his knees and levelled his glass marble eyes at her. What have you done now? He went on staring while Sophie exclaimed. A scarecrow, he said. Calcifer agreed to speed up the castle because of a scarecrow. Dear Sophie, please do tell me how you bully a fire demon into being that obliging. I'd love to know. I didn't bully him, Sophie said. It gave me a turn and he was sorry for me. It gave her a turn and Calcifer was sorry for her, Hal repeated. My dear Sophie, Calcifer is never sorry for anyone. Anyway, I hope you enjoy raw onions and cold pie for your supper, because you've almost put Calcifer out. There's the cake, Michael said, trying to make peace. The food did seem to improve Howl's temper, although he kept casting anxious looks at the unburning logs in the hearth all the time they were eating. The pie was good cold, and the onions were quite tasty when Sophie had soaked them in vinegar. The cake was superb. While they were eating it, Michael risked asking Howl what the king had wanted. Nothing definite yet, Howl said gloomily, but he was sounding me out about his brother quite ominously. Apparently they had a good old argument before Prince Justin stormed off, and people are talking. The king obviously wanted me to volunteer to look for his brother, and like a fool, I went and said I didn't think Wizard Solomon was dead, and that made matters worse. Why do you want to slither out of looking for the prince? Sophie demanded. Don't you think you can find him? Rude as well as a bully, aren't you? Howl said. He'd still not forgiven her about Calcifer. I want to get out of it because I know I can find him, if you must know. Justin was great buddies with Solomon, and the argument was because he told the king he was going to look for him. He didn't think the king should have sent Solomon to the waste in the first place. Now, even you must know there is a certain lady in the waste who is very bad news. She promised to fry me alive last year, and she sent a curse out after me. I've only just avoided because I had the sense to give her a false name. Sophie was almost awed. You mean you jilted the Witch of the Waste? Hal cut himself another lump of cake, looking sad and honourable. That's not the way to put it. I must admit I was fond of her for a time. She's in some ways a very sad lady, very unloved. Every man in Ingeray is scared stiff of her. You should know how that feels, Sophie dear. Sophie's mouth opened in utter indignation. Michael said quickly, Do you think we should move the castle? That's why you invented it, wasn't it? That depends on Calcifer. Hal looked over his shoulders at the barely smoking logs again. I must say, if I think of the king and the witch both after me, I get a craving for planting the castle on a nice frowning rock 1,000 miles away. Michael obviously wished he hadn't spoken. Sophie could see he was thinking that 1,000 miles away was a terribly long way from Martha. But what happens then to your Letty Hatter, she said to Hal, if you up and move? Oh, I expect I'll be over all that by then, Hal said absently. But if only I could think of a way to get the king off my back. I know. He lifted his fork with a melting hunk of cream and cake on it and pointed it at Sophie. You can blacken my name to the king. You can pretend to be my old mother and plead for your blue-eyed boy. She gave Sophie the smile, which she had no doubt charmed the Witch of the Waste, and possibly Letty too, firing it across the fork, across the cream, straight into Sophie's eyes, dazzlingly. If you can bully Calcifer, the king should give you no trouble at all. Sophie stared through the dazzle and said nothing. This, she thought, was where she slithered out. She was leaving. It was too bad about Calcifer's contract. She'd had enough of Howl. First Glean's green slime, then glaring at her for something Calcifer had done quite freely, and now this. Tomorrow, she would slip off to an upper folding and tell Letty all about it.